So it's a pleasure to be here with you today from Oxford University and having the opportunity to share with you some of the research we are doing here at Oxford Martin School, where we try to understand how technology is reshaping the world of work and what that might mean for the future. We are currently living through an age of automation anxiety, and few people believe that the tornado coming from the office is going to be beneficial to them. In fact, in the United States, a recent Pew Research survey suggests that most Americans today favor policies to restrict the implementation of machinery beyond hazardous and physically demanding tasks. Yet, when I was a student, quite a long time ago now, I was told that machines taking people's jobs should be the very last thing that we should worry about. Because if we plot economic growth over history, what you get is essentially a hockey stick, where you see that economic growth in terms of GDP per capita was stagnant for millennia and took off in extraordinary fashion around 1800. The reason for that was essentially the displacement of the domestic system with the mechanized factory, and this was the key driver of the Industrial Revolution. As the mechanized factory, with its extreme divisions of labor and the adoption of machinery into specific tasks, essentially displaced the artisan shop, we became able to produce more with fewer people, and as a result of that, economic growth took off in extraordinary fashion. Now, if we look at incomes alone, that, if anything, understates the extraordinary changes or the extraordinary progress that has been taking place. The average American today is roughly 30 or 40 times even richer than they were in the middle of the 19th century. But imagine going back in time with 50 times higher of income. There's a lot of things that you couldn't have bought. Sure, you could have bought more potatoes, but there was no antibiotics, automobiles, refrigerators, microwaves, so on and so forth, right? And the people, ordinary people, could only dream of the lives of the upper classes who had servants to do the most tedious work for them. Today, we all have access to the electric servant in terms of washing machines, dishwashers, electric irons that do a lot of tedious work for us in the home. And if that isn't enough, producing those goods and earning those higher incomes has become a lot more comfortable to us as well. Back in the 19th century, a lot of people worked in mines and factories. Those people working in the mines didn't see sunlight often for days, and often explosions, cave-ins were part of everyday working life. That differs quite substantially from the people today that are able to work in air-conditioned offices. To many of us, the worst thing that can happen is that the coffee machine breaks down. So the past 2 centuries has been an extraordinary upward trend of economic growth and progress. Yet, what did people say at the days of the Industrial Revolution when this extraordinary growth first took off? Well, back in 1844, some clearly marveled about the rise of machines. Benjamin Disraeli, before he became Prime Minister of Britain, published a novel called 𝗥𝗛𝗧𝗩𝗶, in which one character is struck by the technological progressiveness of the time, suggesting that surely Manchester would be the most wonderful city of modern times because its vast population of machines. The very same year that 𝗥𝗛𝗧𝗩 appeared, Frederick Engels published his book on the condition of the working classes. And his book was written precisely during a stay in Manchester, and his take of what's going on was very different from that of Benjamin Disraeli. Engels asserted at the time that machines were only used to deprive people of the jobs and livelihoods, and didn't serve the interests, what he called, of the working classes in Britain. Now, Engels, we know, was wrong about the future, because wages did begin to rise steadily beginning in the 1840s. But he was in fact right about the past. For roughly 7 decades in Britain, wages were stagnant. And if we look at other indicators of well-being, such as consumption or heights, what we find is that people spent less on non-essentials in 1850 than they did in 1750, and the cohorts born in 1850 were also shorter than those born in 1750. And it is important to remember that this was also a time of extraordinary social and political upheaval. What began with the adoption of machinery in the factories and ended with the construction of the railroad also ended with the publication of the Communist Manifesto. And economists and historians have long puzzled about why people would willingly participate in the industrialization process if it reduced their utility. The truth is that they didn't. The Luddites, as they were called, rioted against the mechanized factory. They petitioned to Parliament to block the spread of machinery, and they expressed their attitudes towards technological progress in verse like the following one. Today, levels of income inequality are approaching levels not seen since the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the trajectory of the Gini coefficient, you can see this both in the United States and America, and indeed also in other advanced economies. And obviously, the driver of this is not spinning machines. This time around, computerization is the driver of much of the income disparities that we're seeing across the industrial West today. Every new computer technology since the 1940s have essentially constituted a cheaper substitute to human labor than its predecessors. But computers for a long time were too bulky and expensive to be adopted on a wider scale. Computerization essentially took off in the 1980s with the invention of the personal computer, which were adopted on broader scale in the workplace. And we can see its impact on the labor market if we look to the trajectories of output per capita growth and wage growth, which decoupled beginning in the 1980s. From that point onward, technological progress served to replace workers in existing tasks rather than augmenting them and creating new tasks for them. And this has been particularly evident when you look at the wages of prime-aged men who would have taken on jobs in the factories before the dawn of automation. For all the talk about inequality, the greatest concern is actually that the wages of prime-aged men have fallen for 3 consecutive decades as employment opportunities for semi-skilled workers have dried up. And we can see this also across the industrial West when we look at the disappearance of middle-income jobs. It is a pattern that across the industrial West, routine rule-based jobs that can easily be specified in computer code and therefore readily automated have vanished. But on the other hand, we've seen new jobs being created in technology sectors and professional services when people benefit from computer technologies, right? For me, for example, as an economist, I'm now able to use statistical software to be able to write more papers than I could have done a generation ago. So a key feature of technological progress over the past 3 decades has been the automation of middle-income jobs, which are intensive in routine rule-based activities that can be specified in computer code and therefore readily automated. And at the same time as those jobs have vanished, we've seen the creation of new technology jobs in software, in biotechnology, and also in professional services. And what happens is that if you create a skilled job in the technology sector in a city like Oxford, and that person goes out in the local service economy, spends his or her money on services, which in turn creates a lot of new jobs in the local service economy as people go to the hairdresser, go grocery shopping, take a taxi, and so on and so forth. And this has led to this hollowing out of the labor market that we are also familiar with today. The point, though, is that while this has been going on for 2 to 3 decades, we have seen nothing yet. Recent advances in technology, and in particular in the field of artificial intelligence and mobile robotics, means that the potential scope and the potential set of tasks that machines can substitute for workers in has expanded enormously. Instead of now having one computer programmer needing to program top-down exactly what the computer should do at any given contingency, we can essentially feed the machine the data which allows us to learn and draw upon our experience. And this is essentially how, for example, Google Translate works, right? When the United Nations puts out a document, it is by law required to be translated into 6 different languages. That means that the computer or the algorithm has more humanly translated text to draw upon when you type in your phrase into Google Translate. So by having more data, it means that it can find more potential matches for the phrase that you're typing in and better predict the word that you're looking to translate. In similar fashion, algorithms are very much behind recent advances in autonomous driving. So for example, if you take the 𝗥𝗏𝗧𝗩, which is used to deliver food and medicine in hospitals, that is quite straightforward because a programmer can specify in advance most of the situations that the robot is likely to encounter, right? If a person comes in front of the robot, you can simply specify that the robot should stop. But if you go to, for example, driving in the streets of Oxford, there are so many different situations that a person can encounter with bicycles, with people running across the road, with the different weather conditions and so on. So it's almost impossible to predict or specify in advance exactly all the situations that you might encounter. The way that we now try to automate this is by predicting what the human driver would do in a given situation. So by having cars collecting enormous data sets from the encounters human drivers have in traffic, the machine is now able to predict what we would do in a given situation. Now, some of you will say that, well, is this technology actually that good, right? Google Translate, we all know, has its flaws, and clearly autonomous vehicles are not on the road yet. But it's important to remember that every technological revolution has started off with imperfect technology. The early steam engines that powered the Industrial Revolution in its early days were only used to drain coal mines, and even that they didn't do particularly well. But it's important to remember that human drivers perform far from perfectly when it comes to driving or translation, and indeed This is a study of Israeli judges and their decision making during the day. And what you see in this slide is that when insulin levels are high, we tend to make a high share of favorable decisions. That then drops off during the morning break, jumps up back again after we have done morning snack. And then again you see the same pattern after lunch. I think it would be a good way if we could automate this away. Another reason that we tend to underestimate the potential scope of automation is not just that machines don't have to be perfect to function, they just have to be better than we do, but also in many ways we can simplify the way something is done, which makes that work automatable. So even today we wouldn't be able to automate the job or replicate the exact motions of a medieval craftsman, right? The way we automated factory work was by dividing it up in a structured factory setting, which allowed us to gradually automate that work away. In similar fashion, we didn't automate away the jobs of lamplighters by building robots that can climb lampposts, and we didn't automate away the jobs of laundresses by creating robots or building robots that could walk out of the home, chop down trees, carry wood and piles of water into the home, heat it on the stove, and then perform the motions of hand washing. We did that by inventing the electric washing machine. And so the potential scope of automation, we believe, is much more significant than what most people estimate. And when we gathered a group of professors in machine learning and mobile robotics up at the Engineering Sciences Department here in Oxford, we found that there are roughly 3 key bottlenecks to automation in which human workers still hold a comparative advantage. And those relate to creativity, complex social interactions, and the perception and manipulation of irregular objects. So, for example, when it comes to complex social interactions, the state of the art is best described by the Turing test, where chatbots try to convince human judges of them being a person. And some people argue that there was a breakthrough 3 years ago when a chatbot called Eugene Goldman managed to convince 30% of human judges of it being a person. But it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old boy speaking English as his second language. And if you think about the variety of much more complex social interactions that we do in our daily jobs, where we try to persuade people that we're right, we negotiate deals, we try to motivate the people we work with, these are far outside the scope of computers. The same is true when it comes to creativity, and I think here there is a tendency to conflate originality and creativity. I could certainly make a novel drawing and call myself an artist, but it's very unlikely that somebody else would buy my painting. And being able to create something new is not being creative. Creativity is something that is very deeply embedded in our values, and it's very hard to explain what it is. Now, some will point out that there is already computer programs that write, for example, classical music. And you can indeed take a database of all the symphonies that have been created in history, say that these are the Mozart symphonies, they are the best one by far, and the other ones that they are not so good, if you think that Mozart symphonies are the best, of course. And what you would then get is an algorithm drawing up some recombination of those symphonies. But that will probably take you to something that sounds very much like Mozart. It wouldn't take you to Stravinsky, Schoenberg, or Arvo Pärt. And the bottom line is that we, in many of our jobs, draw upon experience which doesn't just come from the domain we're in, right? An artist, for example, can draw upon experience from other forms of art or from interactions with other people, or maybe even a dream. So in many cases, what we draw upon will always lie outside the data that we have in our training data sets. Lastly, when it comes to the perception and manipulation of irregular objects, a fairly straightforward thing for me to do is to pick up this glass and take a sip of water. But if you want a robot to do the same thing, it's actually not that straightforward, because the first thing you need to do is to identify the object before you pick it up, which is tricky in this case because the glass is transparent, you can see through it. And the second thing you need to do is that you need to make sure that you apply the right amount of pressure in order not to break it. And you can surely do precisely, teach a robot to do precisely that task over and over again. But if you think about the variety of much more complex objects you have in your home, it's almost inconceivable that we will have a general purpose robot that will be able to identify and distinguish between all of those objects, yet manipulate them, right? Straightforward things for us, like distinguishing between something that is rubbish or a very important document, or distinguishing between a pot that is dirty and needs to be clean and a pot that holds a plant, is not as straightforward as it seems. And I would predict that one of the last things we're going to see automated away will actually be, unfortunately, be the cleaner. Now, looking forward, there are actually quite a few number of jobs that aren't very intensive in tasks that correspond to these engineering bottlenecks to automation. According to our estimates, roughly 47% of jobs are exposed to automation as a result of recent advances in artificial intelligence and mobile robotics primarily. And the jobs that are potentially affected are not just production jobs or back office clerical jobs. Many of them span from transportation, logistics, sales and services, you name it. Now, it is certainly true that we are much better able to predict the share of existing jobs that could be automated away rather than the new jobs potentially emerging, right? If you go back to 1900, nobody could have predicted that people would work as software engineers in nanotechnology, as hot yoga teachers. All of these sort of jobs were completely inconceivable back then. And similarly, today, we struggle to envision what the jobs of the future will be. But we can at least now cast some of the occupations that are just about to emerge. LinkedIn did a little study on their platform a few years ago, and what they found among the fastest growing jobs of their platform were big data architects, social media interns, but also Zumba instructors. And they found jobs like machine learning engineer and Android developer, but they also found jobs like beach body coaches. And if we look back to recent years, a prime driver of job creation has been the labor multiplier, where new jobs have been created in tech industries, those people going out in the local service economy, spending their money on in-person type of services, which are hard to automate. And I suspect that the labor multiplier is going to continue to be a main driver of job creation going forward. The trouble with this, though, is that also means that the world is not becoming flatter, right? If you go back to the 1990s, there were a lot of people predicting the end of the city because communications technology would allow us to essentially work from home or work from the beach or wherever we liked, because the world would be flat, right? There would be no need for people to cluster in cities where housing is expensive. In fact, we've seen the opposite happening. New jobs in digital industries tend to be highly clustered, as places like Silicon Valley bears witness to. And what happens then when these jobs are being created is that increases a lot of demand for these in-person type of services, and more people tend to move into the cities where the demand for those type of services is, which in turn drive up house prices in the prime locations and makes it harder for people to move in there. On the other hand, what we're seeing is that when new technologies are primarily creating jobs in skilled cities with an abundance of skilled workers, they've taken away jobs in other places, and primarily old manufacturing cities. So a caricature of this would be Detroit and the Bay Area. In a place like Detroit, robots have automated the assembly line. As a result of that, people in manufacturing industry has seen opportunity vanish, and those people in turn supported a lot of incomes in the local service economy, which has taken a hit of the result. In the Bay Area, as I just described, technology has had very much the opposite effect. Now, if we look at the United States, unemployment today is roughly 4%. So it's not like we're suffering from widespread technological unemployment. But the geographical disparities are actually quite significant. And that is no wonder, because if you look, for example, at the map of the adoption of robots, they are highly concentrated to the Rust Belt. And if you want to understand, for example, why the President Trump managed to win 3 key states, being Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that have firmly been in Democratic hands every election since 1992, robots is definitely part of the explanation. In the communities that have been hit by both globalization and automation, people have been more prone to opt for populist forces. And looking forward, I think that this is a concern that needs to be taken very seriously, because there is nothing that says that positive attitudes to technological progress of the 20th century will persist. And as I discussed earlier, during the 19th century, where a lot of people lost out to technological progress, they rioted against the mechanized factory. Now, I'm definitely not predicting a next wave of machinery riots, but I think that the economist 𝗖𝗿𝗹 was onto something when he suggested that if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what happened on the farms might have turned out differently. They might have used the political rights, the political clout to bring the spread of the tractor to a halt. And as I discuss in my forthcoming book, The Technology Trap, resistance to automation has been the historical norm rather than the exception. Before the Industrial Revolution, craft guilds were a strong political force across Europe, and they did everything that they could to resist the implementation of new technologies. And if people no longer believe that they are likely to see the benefits of these new technologies, maybe for years or even decades, that is in itself reason for concern. Because if people don't believe that they will benefit for something, they tend to opt against it. That is what has recently happened with globalization, but automation has also had similar effects. And as I mentioned, we have seen nothing yet. And for that reason, I believe that we do need to be concerned with the short-term dynamics of this. And I firmly believe that artificial intelligence is going to be hugely beneficial to us over the long run. It will allow us to focus on complex social interactions and creativity in our jobs, which are the things that we enjoy the most. It will provide a lot of new goods and services to us that we can't even imagine. And it will boost productivity and make us richer in the process. But a lot of people, and particularly unskilled workers, are likely to see their jobs vanish in the short run. And we need to make sure that we manage this transition to make sure that positive attitudes towards technological progress remain. In the book, I outline a host of policy proposals to help people adjust to the accelerating pace of change. Let me mention 2 of those. First of all, we don't know exactly what the skills of the future are going to be, but we do know that children that have early deficiencies in math and reading struggle to catch up later in life. So interventions early in life in terms of investment in early childhood education is going to be critical looking forward. And also what we've seen is that much of this the pains from technological progress have felt intensely in old manufacturing cities. And as some places expand and others decline, connecting those places could be hugely beneficial. So for example, close to where I grew up in southern Sweden, Malmö was a city which lost its shipyard back in the 1980s and suffered nearly 2 decades of very slow growth as a result of that. Things changed with the construction of the Öresund Bridge, which allowed people to stay put, live in Malmö, and commute to Copenhagen, where there were better jobs available. And as people stayed put, commuted to Copenhagen for work, they spent money locally, which gave boost to the local service economy. And I believe that by connecting places, dynamic labor markets which provide opportunity with places in decline, we can help foster that transition. So thank you very much for your attention.